The heavy oak door of the church groaned shut, sealing Leanne in with the suffocating heat and the 100 pairs of eyes that felt like tiny, sharp stones against her skin. She stood at the altar in her dark blue dress, the fabric a stark, somber contrast to the sun-bleached wood of the pews. The air was thick with the scent of dry dust, wilting wildflowers, and the town's collective, unspoken judgment. Beside her stood the man they were giving her to, Jedediah. He was a silhouette carved from rumor and fear, a tall, broad-shouldered figure whose face remained shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He had not spoken a single word to her, not when Mr. Abernathy, his face a mask of false piety, had delivered her to the church steps. Not when he had taken her arm, his touch surprisingly light for a man of his size. Not now, as the preacher fumbled with his worn Bible, his voice trembling as if he were officiating a funeral, not a wedding. Leon's own family was absent, their debt to Abernathy the invisible chain that had dragged her here. Abernathy sat in the front pew, a smug, proprietary look on his face, the architect of her ruin. She felt a tremor run through her, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She was 18. Her life was supposed to be a scroll of paper waiting for beautiful characters to be written upon it, not a crumpled, blotted page being handed to the most feared man in the territory. The preacher's words were a meaningless drone, a river of sound that flowed around her without touching her. She focused on a crack in the floorboard, a dark line snaking through the wood, and imagined herself shrinking, becoming small enough to slip through it and disappear into the cool earth below. "Do you?" The preacher's question pierced the haze. All eyes were on her now. She could feel Jedediah turn his head slightly, his gaze finally settling on her. She did not look up. She couldn't. A sharp nod from Abernathy was all the answer required. The preacher cleared his throat, rushing onward. "And do you, Jedediah, take this woman?" He did not hesitate. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "I do." It was the first time she had heard it, and the sound sent a fresh wave of fear through her. It was the voice of a man who knew hardship, a voice that held no room for softness. The finality of the ceremony was a physical blow. She was his now. The town's whispers confirmed it as he led her out into the blinding summer sun. They pitied her, yes, but they were also relieved. The monster of the outer lands had been given a distraction, a sacrifice to keep him from their own doors. He led her to a large black horse, its coat gleaming like polished jet. Without a word, he lifted her, his hands firm at her waist, and settled her onto its back before mounting behind her. His presence was a wall of heat against her back as they rode away from the town of redemption, a place that had offered her none. The journey was a silent eternity. The landscape shifted from the dusty, well-trodden paths of the town to a rugged, untamed wilderness of rocky outcrops and sentinel pines. The air grew cleaner, sharper. Leon kept her spine rigid, her hands clenched in the folds of her dress, trying to create a space between her body and his. But with every jostle of the horse, she was reminded of his solid, unyielding presence. He was a cage of muscle and bone surrounding her. She watched the sun bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and violet, a beautiful, heartbreaking farewell to the life she had known. When they finally arrived, the last light of dusk was fading. The ranch was nestled in a small valley, a simple, sturdy-looking house flanked by a barn and a corral. It was isolated, stark, and utterly silent save for the sigh of the breeze through the tall grass. It was a place built for solitude, not for two people. He dismounted first, then reached up for her. For a terrifying moment she froze, her limbs refusing to obey. He simply waited, his arms outstretched, his patience a more unnerving thing than any show of force would have been. Finally, she allowed him to lift her down. Her feet touched the ground, and she felt the full weight of her new reality settle upon her. She was here, in the middle of nowhere, with a man whose silence was as vast and intimidating as the land itself. He led her inside the house. It was sparse, clean, and smelled of wood smoke and leather. A single lamp cast a warm, golden glow over a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a stone hearth. There was a plate of cold bread and cheese on the table. He gestured toward it, then toward a closed door. "That room is yours." His voice was just as gravelly as it had been in the church. He took a piece of the bread and walked back outside, leaving her alone in the sudden, echoing silence of the house. She stood frozen in the center of the room, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading into the night. The door he had indicated was her room. It was small, with a narrow bed covered by a simple quilt and a single window that looked out onto the dark, imposing shapes of the mountains. There was no lock on the door. There was nowhere to run. She was a prisoner in a cage without bars. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm that was both terrifying and, in a way, predictable. Leon would rise with the first hint of gray light, the chill of the high country morning seeping through the floorboards. She would find coffee already brewed on the stove, hot and black, and a portion of whatever was available, oatmeal, bread, sometimes bacon, left for her on the table. Jedediah would already be gone, a distant figure moving against the vast canvas of the land, mending fences or tending to his small herd of cattle. She learned the landscape of her new life through routine. She swept the floors, the soft whisk of the broom a comforting sound in the overwhelming quiet. She washed their plates, the warm water a small, grounding comfort for her hands. She discovered a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the house and began to coax life from it, her fingers finding a familiar solace in the soil. The work was a shield against the fear, a way to mark the passing of time. They rarely spoke. Their interactions were a silent ballet of shared space. He would enter the house for the midday meal, his face streaked with dust and sweat, and wash at the basin by the door before sitting at the table. She would place a plate of food before him, and they would eat without a word, the only sounds the clink of forks against stoneware. His eyes, she noticed, were a deep, startling gray, the color of a stormy sky, and they rarely met hers. He wasn't cruel. This was the most confusing part. He was a ghost in his own home, a man wrapped in a shroud of silence, but there was no malice in him. One afternoon, a stray dog, thin and wary, appeared at the edge of the property. Leon watched from the window as Jedediah stopped his work, stood perfectly still for a long moment, and then slowly placed a piece of his own lunch on the ground before backing away. He did this every day, a silent offering, until the dog finally trusted him enough to take the food from his hand. She saw him tending to a horse with a lame leg, his large, calloused hands moving with a gentleness that seemed utterly at odds with his fearsome reputation. He would spend hours with the animal, speaking to it in a low, soothing murmur, words he never offered to her. These small moments were cracks in the facade, glimpses of a man different from the monster the town of Redemption had described. She began to see not a threat, but a profound and deep-seated sadness. The house itself held secrets. In a dusty chest at the foot of her bed, she found not clothes or linens, but a small collection of items that did not belong to a solitary man. There was a worn copy of a book of children's rhymes, its pages softened by countless readings. Tucked inside was a pressed wildflower, its color faded, but its shape still perfect. Beneath it lay a woman's shawl, woven with threads of pale blue and silver. It was soft, and it smelled faintly of lavender and sorrow. She held the shawl to her face, inhaling the ghost of a scent, the ghost of a life that had existed here before her. Who was she? What had happened in this quiet, lonely house? The question settled in her mind, taking root alongside the seeds in her garden. She started leaving a wildflower from the garden on the dinner table each evening, a small splash of color in the otherwise austere room. He never acknowledged them, but she noticed he never threw them away either. He would simply move the small vase to the windowsill after the meal was done, where the flowers would catch the morning light. It was a silent conversation, the only one they knew how to have. One evening, a fierce summer thunderstorm rolled down from the mountains, the sky turning a bruised purple. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. A steady drip began to fall from the ceiling directly over Leon's bed. She placed a bucket underneath it, but soon another leak started, and then another. The sound of the dripping water was a maddening, relentless rhythm counting out her misery. She sat on the edge of her bed, wrapped in her thin blanket, shivering more from loneliness than from the cold. The door to her room opened without a sound. Jedediah stood there, a silhouette against the lamplight from the main room. He looked at the buckets, then at her. He didn't speak. He simply walked to her bed, gathered her blanket and pillow in his arms, and carried them into the main room. He laid them on the floor near the stone hearth, where a small fire was crackling, its warmth a welcome embrace. He then took his own blanket from his room and placed it in the dampest corner of the house, far from the fire's glow. He gestured for her to take the warm spot. "You'll be safe here." The 3 words were a lifeline thrown across a vast ocean of silence. It was more than he had ever said to her at one time. She lay down by the fire, the flickering light dancing on the rough-hewn wooden walls, and listened to the storm rage outside. For the first time since coming to this place, she did not feel like a prisoner. She felt protected. The storm passed, but something inside the quiet house had shifted. The silence between them began to feel less like a wall and more like a space they shared. She started humming softly as she worked in her garden, and he didn't seem to mind. He began leaving the most interesting stones he found during his work, pieces of quartz that glittered in the sun, smooth river rocks, on the porch railing for her. They were small, unspoken gifts, acknowledgments of her existence. But the world outside the valley had not changed. A month after the wedding, their supplies ran low, and a trip to Redemption became unavoidable. The thought of returning to the town, to the stares and whispers, filled Leon with a cold dread. Jedediah seemed to feel it too. A grim tension settled over him the morning they were to leave. He rode with his back straighter, his hand resting near the worn handle of the knife on his belt. As they walked down the town's main street, it was exactly as she had feared. Conversations ceased. Mothers pulled their children closer. People crossed the street to avoid walking on the same side as them. It was as if they carried a disease. They were a spectacle, the monster and his porcelain doll. In the general store, the air grew thick with hostility. Mrs. Gable, the store owner's wife, served them with trembling hands, refusing to look either of them in the eye. As Jedediah counted out the coins for their flour and salt, Mr. Abernathy entered, his presence sucking the remaining warmth from the room. He looked Leon up and down, a cruel, appraising sneer on his lips. "Well, look at that," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still in one piece. I'm surprised. A man with his history, one would expect damage." Jedediah's entire body went rigid. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped along his cheek. He placed a hand on Leanne's arm, a silent command to stay behind him. His knuckles were white. "Leave it, Abernathy," he growled, his voice a low rumble of warning. Abernathy laughed, a short, ugly sound. He relished his power, his ability to torment. "Why? The town deserves to remember what you are. They should know who she's living with. A man whose rage burned down his own home, with his own family inside." The words hung in the air, venomous and sharp. Leanne felt the collective gasp of the onlookers. So this was it. This was the terrible secret, the source of their fear. She looked at Jedediah's back, at the immense tension in his shoulders. She thought of the gentle way he tended the lame horse, the patient way he left food for the stray dog, the selfless way he had given her the warm, dry spot by the fire during the storm. The man Abernathy described was not the man she knew. Before Jedediah could react, before the coiled violence in him could spring, Leon stepped out from behind him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was clear and steady. It cut through the thick, hateful silence of the store. "He is a good man." The simple declaration was a stone dropped into a still pond. Every eye turned to her, shocked into silence. Abernathy's sneer faltered. This was not part of his script. The Chinese girl, the quiet, frightened bride, was not supposed to speak. She was not supposed to have a voice. Her unexpected defense seemed to break a dam inside Jedediah. He turned, not to Abernathy, but to the silent, watching faces of the townspeople. His own voice, raw with a pain that had been buried for years, filled the store. "The fire," he began, his gray eyes locking on to Dr. Miller, who had just entered. "It started in the barn. Abernathy's faulty lantern, the one he swore was safe. He was storing undeclared oil, too close to the hay." A murmur went through the crowd. "My wife, she went back in for our son. I tried to follow, but the roof came down." His voice broke, the memory a fresh, open wound. "Abernathy was the first one there. He saw what his greed had caused. So he told all of you a different story. He said my temper, a fight we never had, was to blame. He used your fear to hide his guilt, just as he used my grief to indebt me to him." He looked at Abernathy, and for the first time Leon saw not a monster, but a man shattered by loss. "He took everything from me, my home, my family, and then he took the one thing I had left, my name." Dr. Miller stepped forward, his face grim. "I remember that night. Abernathy's story never set right with me. The way the fire spread, it was too fast, like there was an accelerant." He looked around at the stunned faces. "We listened to the loudest voice, not the truest one." The truth, once spoken, could not be unheard. The town's certainty began to crumble, replaced by a creeping collective shame. Abernathy, his face pale and sweating, backed away and fled the store. No one stopped him. In the sudden quiet, Dr. Miller turned to Leanne. "Miss," he said, his voice gentle, "your family's debt to Abernathy. I and some other men in this town will see it settled. You are free. You do not have to go back with him if you do not wish it." It was the choice she had never had, a path back to a life of her own. She could walk away from the silent man and his lonely ranch. She looked at Jedediah. He was not looking at her but at the floor. His shoulders slumped as if the confession had taken the very bones from his body. He expected her to leave. Everyone did. She thought of the quiet life they had built, the unspoken language of wildflowers and river stones, the feeling of safety by the fire. It was a fragile beginning, but it was real. She walked to his side and, for the first time, willingly placed her hand on his arm. He flinched, surprised, and finally looked at her. In his stormy gray eyes she saw not a monster, but a man who was just as lost as she was. "I am home," she said, her voice soft but sure. The seasons turned. The harsh summer sun softened into the golden light of autumn. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler, and the quiet rhythm of the ranch deepened into a comfortable harmony. The silence that had once been a barrier between Leon and Jedediah was now a shared peace, a language of mutual understanding. He started talking more, not in long speeches, but in small observations offered while they worked. He would point out the V shape of geese flying south, or tell her the names of the constellations that glittered in the vast, dark sky. She learned that his first wife had loved the wildflowers that grew on the hills, and that his son had wanted to be a blacksmith. He spoke of them with a quiet reverence, sharing his memories with her as if entrusting her with precious jewels. In return, she told him about her home across the ocean, about the festivals and the food, painting pictures with her words of a life he could barely imagine. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountains, he reached over and gently took her hand. His touch was warm and calloused, his fingers lacing through hers. It was not a gesture of ownership or control, but one of connection, of partnership. A soft warmth bloomed in her chest, a feeling she had thought was lost to her forever. "Thank you, Leon," he said, his voice low. "For what?" she asked, her gaze fixed on their joined hands. "For seeing me." He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was a simple, profound gesture of affection that spoke more than 1,000 words of poetry ever could. In that moment, she was not a debt paid, not a sacrifice to a fearsome cowboy. She was a woman, seen and cherished. He was not a monster, not a ghost haunted by his past. He was a man, capable of healing and of love. They had been two broken souls forced together by cruelty and circumstance, but in the quiet solitude of the valley, they had found not just solace, but a fragile, beautiful hope. They had found each other.